Hello everyone and welcome to the final video of Hour of Devastation Limited Review Week. Throughout the week, I've given you my thoughts on each of the 199 cards printed in Hour of Devastation. In this video, we're going to talk about the archetypes in this format by looking at every color pair in the set and see what it's interested in doing. We're going to talk about whether the color pair has a lot of synergistic elements to it or if it's just sort of a good stuff color pair. In this format, it doesn't look like every color pair is going to have maximum synergy, as is the case in some formats, but we'll get to talking about that later. If you're looking for a video that talks about the cards that are most powerful in a vacuum, like the best removal spells, you should check out my other videos, because I'm not going to be talking about cards that are just good in every deck in this video, unless that particular card has special synergy within that particular color pair. Also, this video is going to be quite long. We're talking about hundreds of Magic cards here and the different synergies between them. So in the description below, you can find a timestamp, basically a table of contents that has timestamps for each of the different color pairs in this format. Now let's go ahead and get started with our first color pair. First, we have blue-red spells. Now, it's worth noting that only 5 color pairs in this format have both a typical signpost uncommon in both sets, an Amonkhet and an Hour of Devastation, and the first of these we're looking at is blue-red spells. The other 5 color pairs, which we'll also be talking about, don't have as signposty of an uncommon in Hour of Devastation, but they do all have a gold card with Aftermath in Hour of Devastation. And we'll get to talking about that later, but I just want to make it clear that there are 5 color pairs that I think are just going to naturally be a little more synergistic because of the fact that they have 2 signpost uncommons that really sort of drive home the same message, like these 2 do, whereas the other 5 color pairs don't always have a gold card in Hour of Devastation that is a good reflection of what the gold card in Amonkhet wanted the same color pair to do. So anyway, first we're looking at blue-red spells. Signpost uncommons, as I mentioned, are uncommons that are gold and in a particular color pair and sort of give you a message as to what that color pair wants to do. Bloodwater Entity is the signpost uncommon in Hour of Devastation, and obviously it wants you to play a lot of instants and sorceries. It has prowess. It gets an instant or sorcery from your graveyard and puts it on top of your library when it comes into play. And Enigma Drake also wants you to play lots of instants and sorceries. It gets power equal to the number of instant sorcery cards in your graveyard, which is pretty good. They're both very good cards. If you end up with them and you're in a blue-red spells deck, you're going to feel pretty good about it. Now, let's look at some other spell payoffs that you can find in this format, in addition to these 2 gold cards. So one of them that we have in Hour of Devastation is Riddle Form, which for 1 generic mana and 1 blue is an enchantment that can scry for 2 generic and a blue, but it turns into a 3/3 Sphinx anytime you play a non-creature spell with flying. So if you have a lot of non-creature spells, it's going to regularly be attacking in the air. And you can also do it at instant speed, really mess with your opponent. They can't really attack with their 2/2s. Spellweaver Eternal has Prowess. Prowess is a Spells Matter effect. Firebrand Archer is just a little 2 mana 2/1, but it gives you a little bit of extra value if you can play a lot of non-creature spells by doing 1 damage to each opponent every time you do. Thorned Moloch is another creature with prowess, who also has first strike when he's attacking, so he's a real nightmare to block if you have a lot of spells in your deck. And Magmaroth is the last spell payoff at common or uncommon in Hour of Devastation. It's a 4 mana 5/5 who gets a -1/-1 counter every turn, but he loses a -1/-1 counter anytime you play a spell. It's almost sort of like he has prowess to a certain point, since he'll be a 4/4 when you attack with him every turn, and you can make him into a 5/5. If you can keep him around 4/4 or 5/5 consistently, you're going to be pretty happy with it. Amonkhet, which this format has 2 packs of Hour of Devastation and 1 pack of Amonkhet. If you're doing Draft and if you're doing Sealed, it has, I believe, 4 packs of Amonkhet. 4 packs of Hour of Devastation and 2 of Amonkhet. So you need to be aware of the Amonkhet cards that synergize well with this color pair too, even though you're going to see less of them. And it's worth noting that even though there's only 5 payoffs here in Hour of Devastation, it's a small set and 3 of them are common, so you're going to be able to get multiple copies of many of them. So onward, though, to talking about the Amonkhet cards that give you a payoff for playing spells. Nimbleblade Kenra is another creature with prowess. Warfire Javelineer was great in this format. It was one of the cards that made the blue-red spells deck worth playing, like if you managed to get 1 or 2 of these. It's another card that also cares about instants or sorceries in your graveyard, which is sort of a sub-theme within this color pair. We saw that both of the signpost uncommons care about cards in your graveyard. So does Warfire Javelineer, and if you can kill a creature when it comes into play, you're getting a ton of value. It's a great card. And you also have Cryptic Serpent, another card that cares about instants and sorceries and wants them in the graveyard. And Scribe of the Mindful, which isn't a great card. It wasn't one that I played a lot. It got cut a lot of the time, but it does have instant and sorcery synergy because it can bring them back from your graveyard. And you also have Seeker of Insight, a card that I think kind of overperformed in the format as a 2-mana 1/3 that can allow you to dig through your library. It allows you to loot if you play a non-creature spell that turn, which can help improve things like Cryptic Serpent and Warfire Javelineer if you're discarding instants and sorceries. So now we're going to talk about some of the spells in Hour of Devastation. Obviously, all cards that are removal spells or bounce spells or anything like that are things you're going to want in this deck. I'm not going to talk about all of those here. I'm going to instead talk about the instants and sorceries that are really more geared towards this sort of grindy blue-red spells deck than they are towards any other color pair. These include things like card draw spells and things like that. If a card isn't included here, it doesn't mean you shouldn't draft it or play it in your deck if you have a blue-red deck. All instants and sorceries are good in this deck, and the ones that are good in every deck are extra good in this deck, but we don't need to talk about cards like a Braid and things like that. They're just great, and everybody knows that. But we'll talk about instead about cards that are sort of at their best in this particular deck. One of these is Strategic Planning. I mean, it's, kind of a clunky draw spell at sorcery speed, but it lets you get some good card selection. It's also a sorcery, so it's going to trigger your prowess and things like that. That's what's good about card draw effects in a deck like this, is when you have multiple cards that care, when you're playing instants and sorceries during your turn, doing it multiple times in one turn is going to be nice. So Strategic Planning draws you a card, probably going to get you another instant or sorcery. Also puts cards into your graveyard, which is not all downside. You could be putting cards with Embalm or Eternalize in your graveyard. You could also be putting instants and sorceries into your graveyard that improve your creatures who care about that. Supreme Will is another card with both card selection, and it can be a counterspell when it needs to be. I like the card quite a bit. I don't usually like counter magic, but this has more than one effect. It can be counterspell when you need it to be, but if you get to the late game and the counter magic aspect of it has severely diminished, you can use it for card selection, and pretty deep card selection. You get to look at the top 4. Tragic Lesson, another card draw effect. This one lets you draw 2 cards, and then if you return a land to your hand, you don't have to discard a card. If you don't return the land to your hand, you do have to discard a card, and that's not a big deal. Sometimes you'll be fine discarding it. Sometimes you'll return the land and then just play it again untapped, which is fine. Again, it's going to be good in this deck because this card wants to be playing as many instants and sorceries as possible, and drawing cards is a good way to make sure you're doing that. Countervailing Winds isn't a card I love, but it's okay. This is a deck that's going to have a graveyard with lots of cards in it, at least several cards in it on a regular basis, because you'll be casting so many cheap instants and sorceries like the ones we see here. And so Countervailing Winds will be able to counter a lot of spells, and it also has Cycling in a pinch. And once you cycle it, it improves your cards that care about your instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Unsummon, it's a good card in any blue deck, but it's super cheap, so it's great for getting prowess triggers. It's also great in general because it can bounce massive creatures, small creatures. It can kill a creature token. It can do a lot. It's the kind of card that this deck will really love, and any blue deck will love, but I do think it's at its best here. There's also Crash Through in red, which can give your creatures trample, which isn't bad if you have your Cryptic Serpent in play or other large creatures in play, which this deck can play. It's going to be a sort of controlling deck. And then it also draws you a card. So if you get a prowess trigger and then you play another instant and sorcery, obviously that's good. Combat Tricks are also going to be fairly good in a deck with lots of triggers with instants and sorceries because it gives your creatures an additional boost. Unfortunately, there's really only one really worthwhile combat trick at common or uncommon in Hour of Devastation for this deck, and that's Kindled Fury, which for very cheap cost pumps a creature while also triggering all your cards that care about instants and sorceries. Let's also talk about cards in Amonkhet that I think are most geared towards this particular color pair. This includes Censor, a counterspell that can also just be cycled. Essence Scatter, a good counterspell because people play creatures all the time and it's very cheap. Gale Strike is a card I like a lot because it can give you some big tempo boosts and it also draws you a card. Hieroglyphic Illumination draws you multiple cards, or it can be cycled. Magma Spray was probably the best common in Amonkhet, so, any deck will take it, but this deck is especially happy with it. Winds of Rebuke likes this card because it both puts cards in your graveyard and bounces creatures and triggers instants and sorceries. Tormenting Voice is good too, draws you cards, lets you discard a card, and so forth. There are also rares that are at their best in this particular color pair. I think Hour of Devastation is good in this color pair because this is a controlling color pair. It's also a sorcery. So a board sweeper is going to be better for you than it is going to be for most other people. Wildfire, Eternal, this is basically the best deck for it. It is a 1/4 with Afflict 4, but it has the interesting ability of if your opponent can't block it or they choose to take it, you get to cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand for free. And that's pretty awesome. You put your opponent in a difficult to make situation. Either they have to take 4, or that you might get to cast an instant or sorcery spell for free if you have one in your hand. Of course, you get the Locust God, which is an incredible card in general, and it's good in a controlling deck like this one. It just keeps spitting out tokens every time you draw cards, and this deck's going to be drawing extra cards. And Refuse to Cooperate is the gold card, the gold Aftermath card for this color pair, and I don't really like the Refuse half very much. You know this if you watch my set review, but the Cooperate half is quite good. It lets you copy an instant or sorcery spell. So you'll cast Refuse and get a little bit of value out of it, do a few damage to your opponent, and then in the later game you can use Cooperate on a much more powerful spell. Soulscar Mage has Prowess. It's not a great card. The rest of the text on it is usually irrelevant, though not always. Sweltering Suns is another nice little board sweeper. It was the kind of card that if you got in the last format was one of the cards that could just destroy all of the aggro decks in the format because none of their creatures were big enough to survive Sweltering Suns. And Commit to Memory is a great card in general. It was a first pickable rare in the format. You know, it allows you to either bounce creatures or put spells back into your opponent's library. The memory half I've had come up big too occasionally where your opponent gets ahead of you on cards all of a sudden and then you cast memory. Casting memory with the Locust God in play would be pretty nice. Same with Pull from Tomorrow. This is really the only deck for it. Most decks aren't going to have the time to just sit back and do this, but this deck has so many removal spells and bounce spells that eventually just casting Pull from Tomorrow can just win you the game. So that does it for blue-red. Let's move on to black-green, another color pair that has 2 Signpost Uncommons, one in Hour of Devastation and one in Amonkhet. And again, they both are sort of directing you in the same direction. The new Signpost Uncommon is Obelisk Spider, which is a 3-mana 1/4 with Reach. And whenever it deals damage to a creature, it puts a -1/-1 counter on that creature. And whenever one or more -1/-1 counters are placed on a creature, by you, it has to be by you, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Meanwhile, you know Decimator Beetle from the last set. He was one of the best Signpost Uncommons, attacking and putting -1/-1 counters on things and removing -1/-1 counters from your guys was great. The two of them obviously work pretty well together. And if you get both of them and you're in this color pair, you feel pretty good. The interesting thing is, even though both of these gold cards really push you towards -1/-1 counters, there are not a ton of cards in black-green in Hour of Devastation that put -1/-1 counters on things, which is kind of strange. This is it. That's what you got. You have Lethal Sting, which is very good, admittedly. It's a great kill spell, and it puts a counter on one of your creatures. Torment of Venom, which is a good kill spell and puts counters on your opponent's creatures. And Ifnir Deadlands, the desert that lets you put -1/-1 counters on things. So not a whole lot of support for -1/-1 counters just in Hour of Devastation. We don't have any of those cool creatures we had in the last set that come into play and put -1/-1 counters on things. And that weakens this color pair's ability to synergize well with all this -1/-1 counter stuff significantly. It's worth noting that the Signpost Uncommons are fine even on their own. They're good cards because they have synergies themselves with -1/-1 counters. But this color pair was one that could occasionally come together and be quite strong. You did have to get certain build-arounds, even in Triple Amonkhet, but I think it's going to be weaker now. I think most of the time black-green is just going to be a good stuff deck with some big monsters, some big removal, and maybe a little bit of -1/-1 counter synergy. Now, you do still have all of those cards from Amonkhet, the cards that come into play and put -1/-1 counters somewhere. We'll go over them real quickly. Cards like Baleful Amit, Soul Stinger, which was great because it could manufacture 2-for-1s. Cartouche of Ambition, which was good because it put counters on things and gave your guy lifelink. And these are commons at least, so you have a decent chance of picking them up in your last pack, whereas Baleful Amit at uncommon, not nearly as good of a chance. Festering Mummy puts a -1/-1 counters from where it dies. Ruthless Sniper puts -1/-1 counters places when you cycle it. Splendid Agony, a card you'll probably have a decent chance and be happy to pick up in the last pack. As well. Crocodile of the Crossing was a great card in this deck, and in any deck really, but when you could really make the -1/-1 counter synergy work, it was even more ridiculous. Defiant Great Maw, you had also Exemplar of Strength, and you had Ordinary Kudu, and Stinging Shot, and Grasping Dune. So these cards with -1/-1 counters in Amonkhet sort of lets you build a special kind of deck where you could play cards, 1 and 2 drops who the whole purpose of having them in play was so you could put counters on them sometimes and kill them. And these cool creatures with Enter the Battlefield, put -1/-1 counters somewhere effects were really cool because they had the flexibility of either just being a big creature and killing one of your others or putting the counters on themselves. But it's not something you're going to see as much in this format. As we saw, there's not a single card that comes into play and puts -1/-1 counters on your creatures in this format. In Hour of Devastation, that is. They're still around in Amonkhet, but it's going to be harder to make it work. There are 2 good -1/-1 counter payoffs in Hour of Devastation, despite the fact that there's not a whole lot of ways of making them in Hour of Devastation. Banewhip Punisher is a great card, one of the best uncommons. It makes its own -1/-1 counters, and then it lets you kill creatures that have -1/-1 counters on them. You'd have to sacrifice it, so you can only do it once. Getting it back with various effects like Gravedigger does sound pretty fun, incidentally, but you're not going to have a lot of options other than to destroy the creature you just put a counter on most of the time, which is fine. It's still good. And then there's Tenacious Hunter, who likes for a -1/-1 counter to be somewhere on the board, and then he becomes a 4/4 with Vigilance and Death Touch, and that's no joke. Both of these cards are reasonable first picks. Banewhip Punisher is obviously better than Tenacious Hunter, and I'd be happy with either of them, especially in a -1/-1 counter heavy deck. What's interesting is that a lot of the -1/-1 counter payoffs that there were in Amonkhet were just the fact that you could sort of play these massive creatures early. You had a few other payoffs, though, in Amonkhet that we'll talk about. Nest of Scarabs isn't probably going to get there anymore. It did sometimes get there in Triple Amonkhet, but first of all, it's an uncommon, so you may not even see it. Second of all, you're just not going to be making as many -1/-1 counters anymore in this format. If you had Triple Amonkhet, you could get 10 or 12 ways to do it, and the Nest of Scarabs is playable. Hapatra's Mark was never special. It's still not. Quarry Hauler, while good, has probably decreased in power a little bit because of the fact that there aren't going to be as many counters around in general. And Shed Weakness was a good combat trick for this deck, and it'll still be an okay combat trick. So there are some rares that sort of help you out in the -1/-1 counter department. You have Amit Eternal, who's just a huge, amazing card, first pickable bomb rare. That is a 3-mana 5/5 with a flick 3. When opponents cast spells, he gets -1/-1 counters put on them. But when he deals combat damage, he removes all the counters on him. So it makes your opponent make a choice. Do they want to just afflict 3, or do they want to let Amit Eternal turn back into a 5/5? Good card, cares about -1/-1 counters. Grind to Dust is interesting because it's actually a black-white card. But just the grind half is going to be good in a deck that cares about -1/-1 counters. And if you can make it work, you should try to splash for Dust because it's ridiculous. It says exile any number of target creatures with -1/-1 counters on them. Obviously, Grind sets you up to exile at least 2, but if you have other ways of putting counters on things, it gets ridiculous. And again, this is a black-white card. It'll be ridiculous in a black-white deck, but it'll probably be a little better in this deck because there's more -1/-1 counter things going on. Back in Amonkhet, we had Plague Belcher, which was one of these huge creatures that just came into play and could kill one of your earlier creatures and be a 5/4 with Menace on turn 3, or come into play as a 3/2 Menace. It was a good card. Channeler Initiate, also a good card. Helps you ramp, helps you fix. Comes into play with counters and uses those counters as fuel. Archfiend of Ifnir was one of the biggest bombs in the set. When you cycled things, you got to put -1/-1 counters all on your opponent's creatures. And Hapatra is, sort of a signpost rare that was pretty amazing if you could put her together with a way of repeatedly putting -1/-1 counters on things, like our 2 signpost uncommons can. So she'll still be great in this deck, obviously. She's a 2-mana 2/2 at worst. But again, I think even though this color pair has 2 signpost uncommons, which for the most part to me makes it seem like it's a more supported archetype in this new format, there's just not enough ways of making -1/-1 counters that this deck will always come together and be super synergistic. It'll just probably be a black-green deck that has your best black-green deck will just be one that sort of has a good curve, has some nice top curve creatures and things like that, maybe even some ramp, and it has good removal, and that's about it. And it might have some -1/-1 counter sub-theme going on, but this deck is, while not completely dead, it's kind of on life support now. Next, we have red-white aggro Exert. We have 2 Signpost Uncommons here. The first we knew from the last set, which was Honored Crop Captain, a 2-mana 3/2 that pumps your whole team when it attacks. Our new one is Resolute Survivor, which is a 3/3 that can exert itself when it attacks. And whenever you exert any creature, Resolute Survivor deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So the red-white deck was probably the best deck in Triple Amonkhet draft. It was an incredibly aggressive, powerful deck filled with ways to just curve out and destroy your opponent. Cards like Honored Crop Captain pumped your whole team, Trial of Solidarity pumped your whole team, Uncropped Aven or whatever it was called that gave +1/+1 to your whole team, pumped your whole team when it exerted itself. And all of this just made for a very fast format. Some people have referred to these decks as, this deck is the fun police because it made it so that grindy, dirtily decks didn't really get to shine most of the time in Triple Amonkhet because this deck was just so powerful at just destroying people in the early game. And I think it's still going to be pretty good, though I will say I think its power is going to decrease a little bit. The best exerters are still those that are in Triple Amonkhet. They kind of dialed back on Exert, as we'll see in a moment. In this set, there's fewer creatures with Exert, and the ones that have it, while good, aren't quite as good. And a lot of them aren't as aggressive. Some of them exert themselves and tap themselves for an activated ability instead of pumping themselves up when they attack. So while this deck will still be good, I don't think it'll be the best deck anymore. There's just not going to be as much access to powerful exerters, powerful low-curve creatures. It looks to me like they tried to slow this format down a little bit here and make the format feel a little different. It's still going to be a good deck, though. Don't get me wrong. So let's look at the cards with Exert in Hour of Devastation. One of them is Oketra's Avenger, one of the few very aggressive creatures with Exert in this format. It's a 2-mana 3/1 that when it exerts itself can't take combat damage, which is pretty nice. Works well with combat tricks and things like that, and your opponent's just going to have to take 3 a lot of the time. Steward of Solidarity is one of those cards I was talking about that has Exert, but it doesn't make itself bigger when it exerts itself. Instead, it makes a 1/1 white warrior creature token. So it's not going to be pumping itself up and smashing your opponent, though it is a 2-mana 2/2, which is reasonable anyway, and a good card. And Steward of Solidarity is a very good card. Fervent Paincaster, another creature with Exert, who doesn't actually make itself bigger. Instead, it gets the ability to ping creatures when it exerts itself. So it can do 1 damage to a player without exerting itself, and it can ping creatures when it exerts itself. And it's a good card, but again, not what we're used to seeing after the red-white exerters we saw in the last set. Vizier of the True, though, is the kind of card that can make all of this exerting a real nightmare. One of the things that made this deck so good in the last set was that it had multiple ways of making blockers not matter, and Vizier of the True gives you another one of those. That said, as we're seeing now, the Exert creatures aren't quite as aggressive in this in Hour of Devastation as they are in your last Amonkhet pack, so it's not going to be, hopefully, quite as overpowering as it could be if this set was also filled with low-curve, powerful exerters. Kenra Scrapper, like Oketra's Avenger, is sort of an exerter in the old way, in that it pumps itself, and it's a powerful creature when it does. It becomes a 4/3 with Menace. But those are all of the exerters in Hour of Devastation in these 2 color pairs. There's a 1 common in each color, and then 3 uncommons. So Exert's not going to be around quite as much, which I think and hope will make for a less fast format. That said, Amonkhet's still around. It's in your 3rd pack. And Gustwalker's a common, so you could still pick up multiples of him. He's very, very good. He was probably the best white common in this set. He was just way better than people thought he was. Everyone thought he was going to be good, but he ended up being incredible. Retcrop Spearmaster's still around in your 3rd pack. You got Talkrop Elite, who can also pump your whole team. On-Crop Crasher is one of the best exerters, and maybe the best non-rare exerter in the set, even better than Gustwalker. Its ability to make things unable to block is amazing. Battlefield Scavenger is sort of a exert lord in that it lets you loot anytime you exert. Emberhorn Minotaur is just a big, difficult to deal with monster when it exerted itself because it became a 5/4 with Menace. Nefcrop Entangler was just a 2-mana 2/1 with Trample, but it turned itself into a 3/3 with Trample. Trueheart Twins is another sort of exert lord that pumps your creatures each time you exert a creature, which is nice. But again, I do think Exert's going to be a little less powerful in this particular format because it's just not around as much, and the creatures who have it aren't all pumping themselves. There are other just straight-up aggressive creatures that are going to be good in this deck. They don't all have to have Exert. They are things like Dauntless Aven, which you see here. For 2 and a white. It's a 2/1 flyer. I realized I kind of screwed it up on the screen here. And when it attacks, it untaps a creature. So it actually works well with Exert because you can untap your creature and use its Exert ability again. Mummy Paramount is just a nice little aggressive creature. Burning Fist Minotaur, same thing. A 2/1 with first strike is always nice, and it can pump itself. Defiant Kenra is a boring 2-mana 2/2, but you probably want it in this deck if you need 2/2s. Same with Firebrand Archer. Then in Amonkhet, you have cards like Blood Rage Brawler, True Heart Duelist, and those are very good 2-drops to pick up. Other things that'll be quite good in these decks are Auras and Tricks, because you're going to have a low curve, you're going to be attacking all the time, and you're going to be sort of all in on trying to win the game in the early game, and that's what makes Auras and Tricks good. These sorts of things help you punch through big blockers that would otherwise slow your game. Active Heroism is going to be really good in this deck because it not only provides a decent stat boost, it also untaps your creatures, so if you exerted it, you can do it again. Jeru's Renunciation allows you to tap down creatures and get in for some damage. It can also cycle when it needs to. Blur of Blades is something of a combat trick. I'm not sure how good this is going to be, but it seems all right in this particular deck because it can be used sort of as a combat trick. You weaken your opponent's creature so it dies in combat now, and you get to do damage in the process. Kindled Fury is a good combat trick every time we've seen it. Same with Mighty Leap. Trial of Solidarity is incredible in this deck. It was like mythic rare power level basically in the last format because it was so good in what was the best deck in the format, the red-white aggro deck. And giving your whole team vigilance and +2/+1 is great, especially if you're exerting. Brute Strength, a decent combat trick, and there's of course the Cartouches, both of which are quite good in this deck. There's also rares who are best suited to this particular deck. I like Adorned Pouncer just because it's a 2-mana 1/1 and it will hold it's good with combat tricks, and it's going to be good with auras. And then when it dies, it can come back in the later game as a 4/4 double strike. Earthshaker Kenra is like made for this deck. It comes into play, makes something small unable to block, has haste, and then in the late game, it can make an even larger creature unable to block and come in as a 4/4. Combat Celebrant, this isn't something I ever got to pull off in the last format, but attacking with a bunch of exerters, including Combat Celebrant, and then untapping them all is like the dream because you get 2 exert attacks in 1 turn. Harsh Mentor is just a good 2-mana 2/2 that can punish some of your opponent's activated abilities. And Glorybound Initiate is a very, very good creature with Exert. It becomes a 4/4 with lifelink, which is very strong. That does it for red-white. I think it'll still be a good aggressive deck, but I think its foot has come off the gas pedal a little bit because of the change in how Exert is going to work, for the most part, in the new set. Next, we're going to look at blue-green ramp and grind, I say here. This is because our 2 signposts and commons here don't exactly lead you in the same exact direction, though they do work well together. River Hoopoe is a 2-mana 1/3 with flying who can let you pay 5 mana to gain 2 life and draw a card, and Weaver of Currents is just a great efficient mana-making creature. It makes 2 mana for you, and it's a 3-mana 2/2. So the 2 of them do work well together in the sense that Weaver of Currents ability can be used to pay for River Hoopoe's activated ability, and that's not a bad place to be. And this color pair has a few things going for it. It's the best in the format at fixing and ramping, and it also has access to lots of large creatures that are worth ramping into. It also, because of all the fixing it has, can play a bunch of creatures and other spells that aren't in its primary colors, and that's a nice thing to be able to do. But generally, this deck is going to want to ramp into creatures and then in the late game grind out value with cards like River Hoopoe, just drawing you cards and gaining you life. So first, let's look at all the ramping and fixing that this color pair has access to. You have Beneath the Sands, which lets you search your library for a land, and it has cycling, which is nice because a lot of times when you're in one of these sorts of ramp decks and you need fixing or whatever, sometimes you draw your Beneath the Sands or your Rampant Growth in the late game and it's like, I don't need this now. And that's one of the downsides to playing ramp. This can at least be cycled away once you already have what you need. And when you don't have what you need, it can help you fix. Hope Tender is a great mana creature. It's a 2-mana 2/2, and the turn after you play it, it untaps 2 lands for you for 1 mana, so it ramps you up by 1 mana every time you exert it. Another example of Exert not being so aggressive in this format. Quarry Beetle isn't always going to ramp for you, but if you cycled a Desert early or something like that, it does get it back for you, and you'll be up to 7 mana on the next turn. It's also a decent thing to ramp into, incidentally. And then in Amonkhet, we have Naga Vitalist, a card who was good in the last set. But I think it's going to be even better now because there's just a little bit more ramping around, which includes, again, this is from Hour of Devastation, Oasis Ritualist, which is an incredible ramp creature. It also exerts itself, but doesn't do anything aggressive. It adds 2 mana of 1 color to your mana pool when you exert it, and it can add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool when you don't exert it. But what it means is you can get up to 7 mana on turn 5, and there are some good 7 drops that you want to be playing with that kind of mana, as we're about to see. You also have Oashtra Cultivator, not a card I loved in this deck. It just didn't do enough. It's basically a bad Beneath the Sands in the sense that you have to pay 4 mana for the same effect. So I don't love it. Vizier of the Tumbling Sands, though, is basically the only blue card that really helps you ramp because it untaps permanents. It also has cycling, which isn't too bad. And you also had Gift of Paradise, which is a fine ramp card in this in the format. It was in the last format, and I think it'll be better now because, again, I think the format will slow a little bit. It gains you life, and it adds 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. So it helps you fix, helps you ramp. It's exactly what this deck wants. There's also Spring to Mind, which is a card I had a lot of fun playing in the last format. This is because, in the early game, it helped you find your splash color or whatever. And then in the late game, you had Mind in your graveyard, and it could just draw you extra cards and pull you ahead. There's also Shafet Monitor, who, kind of like Quarry Beetle, is a card that can both help you ramp if you cycle it, or it can be the kind of thing you're ramping into as a 6 mana, 6/5. So now let's talk about the various commons and uncommons that you want to be ramping into with all the ramp that we just talked about. Well, you have Bitterbow Sharpshooters. These are cards from Hour of Devastation we're talking about. It's not a super exciting thing to ramp into, but it's fine. I mean, if you can play it on turn 4, a 4/4 with Vigilance and Reach is pretty real. Devotee of Strength isn't something you actually necessarily ramp into, but like the River Hoopoe, it has an activated ability that's expensive, a nice mana sink where you can spend all your mana to pump your creatures who either have evasion like Trample or just need to get bigger to get through for combat. And in the early game, it can just attack. We have our friend Quarry Beetle here because he's nice to ramp into, and he can occasionally help you ramp. Rampaging Hippo is a card that just has cycling, so you can pitch it in the early game. And then in the late game, you don't hate ramping into a 5/6 with Trample. I think Sifter Worm is like the best thing to ramp into in this new format. It's a 7 mana 7/7 with Trample, which is awesome, but it also has the amazing ability that it scries 3 when it comes into play. And then you also reveal the top card of your library and you gain life equal to that card's converted mana cost. Sifter Worm is especially good because in the late game, scrying 3 is huge. And it's going to be the latest game. Even if you're ramping into this on turn 5 or 6, you don't really need to be drawing any more lands if you just cast Sifter Worm, so you can just get rid of them all and make sure you're drawing more spells. Ominous Sphinx, a nice little attacker in the air if you can ramp into it early. Even if you just played at 5, it's good. Striped Riverwinder, kind of like the Hippo, is a card you can cycle early if you want to, and then in the late game, it's just a big creature with hexproof, which is nice to have. We're also going to talk about commons and uncommons that are worth splashing once you pick up the fixing that just sort of shows up in this color pair. So good cards to splash are going to be premium removal spells that only have 1 colored mana in them and things like that. For example, Desert's Hold. One of the bonuses of playing a color pair like this one that has access to a lot of fixing, is the fact that you can, a lot of the time, just take whatever the best card is out of a pack. Then other people won't be able to do that. Especially like if you open your second pack, it's clear you're in blue-green, and there's a Desert's Hold. If you're in any other color pair, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to splash it. But if you're in this one, it won't be too hard. Similarly, Banewhip Punisher is basically a premium removal spell, as is Lethal Sting. I also have Sand Strangler here. Now, and this comes with the caveat that you probably need to have a few deserts in your deck to make him worth splashing. Once you do, he's great to splash. And it's nice that this color pair has access to Shefet Monitor in Amonkhet, which can actually search you up a desert. So that's kind of a synergy within the color pair. Also, Cast Out is a nice thing to splash from Amonkhet. So now let's look at the rares who fit the best into this particular color pair. All right, so the first rare I want to talk about is Hour of Eternity. This is going to be good in a lot of blue-based decks. It's basically only going to be like at its best if you're paying like 7 for it, which this deck can do more easily than most decks. And if you pay 7 and you get 2 4/4s in play that probably have a bunch of other text on them, that's pretty good. So I like it. I mean, sometimes you'll even be able to ramp even higher, but it's not going to happen a lot. Unesh Cryosphinx Sovereign is, of course, a bomb in any blue deck, but this deck can play it even earlier. It can help you. It draws you cards, and it's a huge flyer in the air, and that's nice. And, you know, you have access to other Sphinxes, too. Who knows what might happen. Hour of Promise is going to be at its best in this deck. It's it's definitely a big incentive to play deserts, because if you pay 5 just to search 2 land cards. For 2 land cards, it's not that good. 5 for 2 lands and 2/2/2 black zombies is actually very good. But you do have to have several deserts in your deck, like at least 5-ish, I would say, before Hour of Promise really becomes worth playing, unless you're desperate for fixing in this color pair, like you have an off-color bomb. We have our friend Sandworm Convergence from the last set, a card everyone has lost to probably at some point or won with. If you can ramp into it early, it just wins you the game, and that's still the case here. There's also a blue-green gold Aftermath card, Reason to Believe, that works well with this deck. It can scry for you early, and then in the late game, it can either draw you a card or cheat a big creature into play. And you're going to be playing big creatures, so it's not that unlikely that you'll pay 5 and get to put like a 6-drop into play with it. Especially if you cast both halves together for 6 mana, and 6 mana isn't super hard for this deck to get to. There's also Mouth to Feed from Amonkhet, which makes a hippo early and then can draw you several cards in the late game once you have your big guys in play. Channeler Initiate is the best mana dork in the format. It's also rare, but it produces a lot of mana and it fixes for you. And Bounty of the Luxa was one of my favorite cards in the entire format. I won a lot of games, ground out a lot of wins with just Bounty of the Luxa and a bunch of bounce spells, and you just eventually win the game. There's, of course, also Nissa in Amonkhet, who's blue-green and has X, so she does a good job in this color pair when you can just make X into, like, 9 or whatever sometimes. Let's talk about some rares that are splashable. That's one of the other nice things about playing a color like green, who has a lot of splashing going on, a lot of fixing going on, because you can start taking rares that other people wouldn't be able to. Again, you pretty much need the rare to have a single colored mana instead of more than one, like 2 or 3 for it to work out, but you can find a way. This deck can splash the Locust God and the Scarab God, so that's awesome. You're playing blue, so splashing that third color isn't going to be that hard if you have a bunch of creatures who produce mana of any color and things like that. I do have Overwhelming Splendor on here. I know I just said having 2 colored mana is usually not ideal, but I think Overwhelming Splendor is so powerful that this is actually the best deck for it, even though it's white. This deck will actually be able to get to 8 mana before it dies and cast Overwhelming Splendor, just basically win the game with it, the same way it can with Sandworm Convergence. You do need like a lot of fixing to make that work, but I would say if you have like 4 pieces, 5 pieces of fixing, you could probably make Overwhelming Splendor work because it's just that powerful. There's also Hour of Glory, which is a very good removal spell. You can also splash all of the gods and Samut. So those are all the gods can be splashed in this deck, basically. I guess one of the 3 new gods can't be splashed, but that's okay. Lots of gods can be splashed, so opening these big bomby rares is a nice thing to do, even though they're not in your primary color pair. So that's what blue-green's about. I think it'll still be more or less the same power level that it was in the last set, where it could come together and you made an amazing deck where you're like Sandworm Convergencing and stuff. But, you know, it was never a great deck in that format because the format was so fast. This format is slowed down, so I think it will improve a significant amount in this new format. The next, and I think final, it's the final color pair that has 2 Signpost gold uncommons in the typical mode, is Black-White Zombies. We have our friend Wayward Servant from Amonkhet, and we also have Unraveling Mummy, who can give lifelink or death touch to attacking zombies. They both like for you to be playing lots of zombies. So, what are the other zombie payoffs that are around? Well, in Amonkhet, in Hour of Devastation, we have a Cursed Horde, who can give attacking zombies indestructible. Pretty strong, especially if you couple it with Death Touch. That'll be fun. Marauding Bone Slasher isn't so much of a payoff. I guess it is. It's a 3-mana 3/3 that can't block, and if you control a zombie, it loses that downside. And that's a pretty real downside. You also have Mummy Paramount, which gets bigger for a turn every time you play a zombie, or one comes into play in any way, actually, enters the battlefield. Unconventional Tactics is kind of a cool card they printed for the zombie deck here. That gives +3/+3 and flying to a creature. Anytime a zombie comes into play, once again, it doesn't have to be cast. You can pay 1 white mana and get it back from your graveyard. So you can just sort of throw zombies into the air against your opponent and keep bashing away in the sky. But those are the only zombie payoffs within Hour of Devastation. Now, again, it's a small set, so you'll see more of these cards than you would if this was a big set. But it's not a ton of payoffs. There are a lot more in Amonkhet. You have Binding Mummy, which ended up being one of the best payoffs for the zombie deck, at least at common or uncommon. Tapping things down and making it so you guys can attack is great. Inno-Catcher's Name pumps your whole team extra if you have zombies. Time to Reflect becomes an amazing removal spell if you have enough zombies in your deck. Lord of the Accursed is a zombie lord, and less interestingly, there's also Embalmer's Tools, which can make your Embalm cast less, or actually also Eternalize in the new set, and it can also tap zombies to mill people, which occasionally is a way you can find a way to win the game in grindier matchups. Now let's talk about zombies that are in the set that don't have zombie synergy, but pair well with all of these cards that care about zombies. So, zombies in Hour of Devastation include Dutiful Servants, just a vanilla zombie that if you need zombies, you'll probably play. Disposal Mummy is basically a vanilla zombie too. It doesn't do a whole lot, but you'll play it if you need zombie synergies. Sunscorched Champion isn't a zombie initially, but it can eternalize into becoming a zombie, and that's enough for this deck. It's just a good card anyway. Carrion Screecher isn't one I'm super excited about, but it's another zombie where if you have all the zombie synergies, sure, you'll play it. Kenra Eternal is a 2-drop with upside. Afflict causes a little bit of extra damage. Lurching Rot Beast is nice because it only has one colored cycling, 1 mana cycling, and it's a 4/2 zombie, which isn't bad. Merciless Eternal isn't a card I like very much. It's kind of like one of the most disappointing uncommons in the set, I think, because you start reading it and you think it's going to do something awesome, but it really doesn't. It just doesn't do enough, I don't think. But, again, if you have enough zombies, you'll play it. And the same is true of Wretched Camel. You need deserts for it to be at its best, or you need zombie synergies. Ideally, you'll have both, but it is a zombie. There are a bunch of zombies in Amonkhet, too, as you know. Cards like Blighted Bat, Cursed Minotaur, Doomed Dissenter makes a zombie, Festering Mummy, Gravedigger, which is a great one because it gets you zombies from your graveyard, Miasmic Mummy, which makes both players discard cards as well, Stir the Sands, which is just an incredible card in any deck. It makes 3 zombies for 6 mana, or 1 for 2 mana and you draw a card, and for 4 mana and you draw a card. Fanbearer was a great card for slowing down some of the aggressive decks in the format, and it still will be. Sparring Mummy is a mummy, and Those Who Serve is also a mummy. It's also worth noting all the cards with Embalm become zombies when they embalm themselves. So Anointer Priest, Oak-Ketch's Attendant, Sacred Cat, Trueheart Duelist, Unwavering Initiate are all cards that are zombies about half the time. So you can sort of count them as half zombies when you're trying to see if you got enough zombies for your zombie deck. There's also rares that work well in this deck. Adorned Pouncer has Internalized, so it comes back as a zombie. Ammon Eternal, who we've already seen, is a huge, powerful creature who happens to be a zombie. Angel of Sanction is good in any deck, but it's also a zombie when it embalms itself. Dread Wanderer is a zombie that just doesn't stay dead. Liliana loves zombies. She makes zombies, she reanimates creatures and makes them into zombies, and she destroys non-zombies. Liliana's Mastery provides you with zombie tokens, and pumps your whole team. Plague Belcher gives you a zombie payoff while also just being a huge creature. And Never to Return is, again, it's a card that's good in every deck, but it also happens to make a zombie out of your graveyard in the later part of the game. So, in general, we've looked at these 5 color pairs that actually have 2 signpost uncommons, one in Hour of Devastation and one in Amonkhet. But I'd say in general, the synergy level is going to drop a little bit in this format. Black-White Zombies was much more synergistic in the last set. Red-White Aggro was more synergistic. And I don't think it's going to come together at quite the same frequency. I think this is going to be a little less synergistic of a format on the whole, because those are the 5 archetypes that I think are the most synergistic, and none of them really jump off the page as being incredibly synergistic. There'll be synergies within your deck, but it's going to be hard to draft a deck that is just look, this is a Black-White zombie deck. I have 12 zombies and 8 zombie payoffs or something like that. It'll happen, but it won't happen as much. So let's move on to the cards that only really have 1 signpost uncommon and then have an Aftermath card. First, we're going to look at what is the blue-white deck, which, if it has any synergy within it, it's probably Embalm or Eternalize. It also has a bit of a Skies thing going on. We had Aven Windguide in Amonkhet, which gives you creature tokens, flying, and vigilance, and itself has Embalm, so it sort of showed you where to go. Now, Farm to Market are uncommon in Hour of Devastation. Doesn't really synergize super well with that. That said, Farm is a great card on its own. It's a good removal spell. Market does let you discard cards, so you can discard cards with Embalm or Eternalize, which works well with Aven Windguide. That's the closest you get to synergy. But let's talk about the other payoffs for Eternalizing or Embalming. Mummy Paramount is a minor one. It'll get +1/+1 because you're getting zombies back. Same with Unconventional Tactics. You can pay white to get this card back anytime you Embalm or Eternalize. The best thing you can do, basically, in this format, and the card that I think will probably be necessary for constructing the most synergistic version of this deck will be Vizier of the Anointed. If you get like 2 of these, you're going to be pretty happy. It puts a creature with Eternalize or Embalm just into your graveyard from your library, which is basically like drawing a card. And then not only that, it allows you to Eternalize, to draw a card anytime you Internalize or Embalm. There's also Anointer Priest, who gains you a little bit of life whenever you Embalm. So let's look at the cards that have Embalm and Eternalize. We've got Steadfast Sentinel. Not a card I like very much, sadly. It's not a card I want to play most of the time, and I don't know that this deck is ever going to be so synergistic that I really want to play it. On the other hand, there's Sunscorched Champion, who we've seen before and is quite good, but an uncommon. Proven Combatant, another common slot wasted for the Eternalized deck, and that's not great news for it, because Proven Combatant and Steadfast Sentinel are both... I mean, Steadfast Sentinel's playable, but Proven Combatant is pretty unplayable. A 1 mana 1/1 early who turns into a 6 mana 4/4 late is nothing special. I don't plan on playing it at all. Sinuous Striker is an okay card, not as good as Sunscorched Champion, but similar. It has the Eternalized late, and it comes into play as a reasonable creature. But that's it. I mean, that's the Eternalize, common and uncommon in this color pair, and that's it. And the 2 commons are bad. So, not good news. That's one reason I think this particular color pair will basically just be a Skies deck more frequently, or just, you know, a deck that, a good stuff deck, which, you know, isn't a bad thing. It's sometimes nice to just draft a deck with a decent power level. It doesn't have a ton of synergy, but synergy does make things more fun. Now, there are cards with Embalm in Amonkhet, like Oketra's Attendant, which was quite good, Sacred Cat, which overperformed, Trueheart Duelist, which is good, Unwavering Initiate, which is good, and Aven Initiate, as well as Tokrop Skirmisher, and Labyrinth Guardian. See, what they did wrong here, I think, that is going to make this deck not really work out, is the commons and uncommons in Amonkhet are way better than basically all of the commons and uncommons with Eternalize in Hour of Devastation. And that's pretty disappointing. So you have to get a lot of them for the deck to really work out. And so generally, again, this will be a blue-white deck that has a little bit of synergy with Embalm and Eternalize, unless you manage to get the uncommon who gives you all sorts of bonuses, draws you cards, and puts an Embalm or Eternalize creature into your graveyard. You're going to be basically playing a blue-white Skies, blue-white good stuff deck, because there are a lot of flyers in this color pair, of course. There are some rares that are well suited to this deck if it actually comes together as an Embalm Eternalize deck, which would include Adorned Pouncer, who has Eternalize, Champion of Wits, who has Eternalize, Angel of Sanctions, who has Embalm. If there's any deck for Anointed Procession, this is it, because, you know, doubling your token output is pretty nice. Glyph Keeper is just a great card in any deck, but it does have Embalm. Same with Vizier of Many Faces. Temet is sort of a signpost uncommon. He's another card that should push you a little harder towards actually trying to make a blue-white Embalm Eternalized deck work, but you're not going to see him until your 3rd pack. But, you know, making a creature token unblockable every turn is nice, and he can Embalm himself, which means he can pump himself. So now let's move on to the blue-black color pair. So blue-black was about cycling in the last set, and it was a pretty mediocre deck, unless you got Drakehaven, basically. This is because the format was just too fast, basically. And cycling ended up not being good enough, and Shadowstorm Vizier wants you to cycle. And then Consigned to Oblivion is the gold uncommon from Hour of Devastation, and it doesn't do anything related to cycling at all. It's just a good card. Still, let's talk about some of the payoffs that do show up in blue-black for cycling in Hour of Devastation, because they're still there, even though the signpost uncommon they gave us doesn't really push us in that direction. One example is Cunning Survivor, who becomes a 2/3 that's unblockable when you cycle. Ominous Sphinx is a great card, and if you can actually take advantage of cycling or discarding, it gets even better. Grizzly Survivor is sort of medium, but it does get bigger when you cycle or discard. It's fine. And Vile Manifestation gets bigger and bigger the more cards of cycling you have in your graveyard, and that's a pretty nice payoff. The Sphinx and the Manifestation are both good, and the Survivors are both fine. So in this case, at least the commons and uncommons they printed that sort of support the archetype are playable, unlike in the blue-white deck where the commons are basically unplayable. There are way more payoffs, though, in Amonkhet. You have Faith of the Devoted, Horror of the Broken Lands, Pitiless Vizier, Ruthless Sniper, Heckma Sentinels, Sacred Excavation sometimes worked if you had enough, and Zenith Seeker wasn't great, but it is a cycling payoff. Now let's look at all the cards with discarding and cycling in Hour of Devastation that work well with all of these particular cards. Alright, so we have Countervailing Winds, which you've already seen. It might even be better in this deck than in the blue-red deck, because if you're cycling a lot, you're going to fill up your graveyard. It also has cycling, so your cycling triggers care about that. Imaginary Threats is kind of a cool card. It's a very hard one to judge without playing with. I'm going to play with it very soon, early on in the format, to see what happens, but it seems to me like it's pretty good when you want to cast it. You know, you can make your opponent's creatures bash into yours, and even if you decide not to block any of them, they don't untap during their next untap step, which means you get 2 attacks with those creatures tapped down. And if your opponent's board is frightening, you can just cycle it away. Sinuous Striker is a guy we've seen before, who has discard a card in his Eternalize cost. Striped Riverwinder just has cycling for 1 blue mana, so it's fine in this deck. Tragic Lesson, you can discard a card with it sometimes. Lurching Rot Beast cycles. Merciless Eternal has a discard a card cost for its activated ability. Razaketh's Right cycles as well. Razaketh's Right could be interesting in this deck, especially if you end up in a Drakehaven deck, because searching up Drakehaven with it seems like a pretty good alternative to just cycling it. There's a lot more cycling and discarding in Amonkhet, of course. Cards like Scarab Feast, Stir the Sands, Unburden, Wander in Death, Wasteland Scorpion, Censor, Compelling Argument, Floodwaters, Hieroglyphic Illumination, and Lay Claim, as well as Shimmer Scale Drake and Vizier of the Tumbling Sands, and River Serpent. Almost all of these cards were playable. In general, I feel like the power level of Amonkhet is just higher. You know, the more I'm going through this video, the more I feel like the general power level of Amonkhet is higher than what we see in Hour of Devastation, which again isn't a bad thing. It means dirtily decks are going to have a chance. There are a few rares that synergize well with this. I like Hour of Eternity because you can cycle away your creatures early, which this deck does a lot anyway, and then in the late game, get them back as 4/4 zombies. Nimble Obstructionist just has cycling, so it lets you do special things when it cycles too. It lets you counter activated or triggered abilities, and it's also a good creature when you cast it. Apocalypse Demon will do well here because you're going to throw a lot of creatures in your graveyard with cycling. Abandoned Sarcophagus is one of the cards that can make this cycling deck that seems fairly mediocre into a good one, I think. It is an amazing engine. If dirtily decks are going to be better in this format, Abandoned Sarcophagus will do it. You can't really play it unless you have like 10 or 11 cards with cycling, so it's really asking you to commit to cycling. But what it allows you to do is cycle cards in the early game, and then in the later game, those cards you cycled away, instead of deciding to cast them later, well, guess what? You can cast them later. So it makes it so all your cards with cycling can be cast from your graveyard after they've been put there. Now, if you have a card with cycling that you decided to cast and it goes to your graveyard, it does get exiled, so it's keeping itself from getting too out of hand, but it seems like a great engine to me for this deck. But you shouldn't take it early because there's no guaranteeing you get enough cycling. But if you see it in pack 2 and you're already at 6 or 7 cyclers, I would be all over Abandoned Sarcophagus. Hollow One is also a nice payoff for cycling. It becomes cheaper and easier to cast, so it won't be that hard to cycle a card and then play it for 3. Not a bad turn to have at all. It also has cycling. Archfiend of Ifnir, of course, is one of the biggest bombs in Amonkhet, and one of the other best reasons to have a lot of cards with cycling in your deck alongside Abandoned Sarcophagus, because it just destroys your opponent's board. Curator of Mysteries, Scries when you cycle things, and then there's, of course, Drakehaven. Another good reason to build around cycling. So cycling, just like it was in the last set, I think is going to be sort of a deck where you need to get some of these rares, like Abandoned Sarcophagus, Drakehaven, Archfiend of Ifnir, for it to be at its best, because those are great cycling payoffs, and the ones at common and uncommon are a lot less awesome, especially the ones that are an Hour of Devastation. So now let's move on to Black-Red. Black-Red in the last set sort of had a synergistic identity, but it didn't really come together that often in my experience playing against it or playing with it. It was mostly just a good stuff deck anyway, but it was sort of built around the idea of discarding and the idea of cycling, but it had a lot of discarding going on, as Merciless Javelinier shows you. Our Signpost uncommon from Hour of Devastation is Claim to Fame, and it works okay with discarding. You can get creatures back with converted mana cost 2 or less, and Fame can give your creature a creature +2/+0 and haste until end of turn. So there's some synergy there, but I don't like Claim to Fame that much in general. It just asks for a lot of setup. You're not going to get to play it early. Probably going to be good in Modern if you're playing a Death Shadow deck, but we don't have that going on here. There are some payoffs for cycling and discarding, of course. We have our friend Grizzly Survivor again, but that's it, really, in this color pair in Hour of Devastation. The other kinds of payoffs you want for discarding are all in Amonkhet, like Faith of the Devoted, Horror of the Broken Lands, Pitiless Vizier, Grim Strider, which you know, Grimstrider wants you to have a small hand, Ruthless Sniper, Flameblade Adept, and Thresher Lizard. So this deck already wasn't very synergistic, and I think it's going to dip back into being even less synergistic. It's just going to be a good stuff deck most of the time. But just in the interest of completeness, here is all of the cards that discard or cycle in our Devastation. Lurching Rotbeast, Merciless Eternal, Razaketh's Right, Burning Fist Minotaur, Inferno Jet, Granitic Titan, and Vile Manifestation, which the Manifestation is another decent reason to be in cycling, by the way. And I think it's going to be better in blue-black because that deck has a higher critical mass of cards with cycling and payoffs for cycling than this color pair does. But there's also a bunch of cards in Amonkhet that discard or cycle, like the Miasmic Mummy, Scarab Feast, Stir the Sands, Unburden, Wander in Death, Wasteland Scorpion, Scavenger, Blood Rage Brawler, Deem Worthy, Desert Ceradon, Limits of Solidarity, and Pursue Glory, as well as Hazaret's Monument, which I think ended up being basically unplayable. But there are a lot of ways to discard and cycle. There just aren't really enough payoffs for it, unless you get some rares again. We've got Apocalypse Demon, which, you know, again, likes all the cards in the graveyard from discarding and cycling. Neheb the Worthy is good in this deck because this color pair just has a lot of Minotaurs in it anyway, and it makes people discard cards, and it gets bigger when you have fewer cards in your hand. Our friend Archfiend of Ifnir is also around, and obviously a good reason to be discarding or cycling. Hazaret the Fervent, same thing. If you can keep your hand small, it's good. It also discards cards. And Dread Wanderer is nice if you're discarding because you can just get it back. But again, I think this color pair probably is the least synergistic of all the ones we've looked at so far. It's just going to be a good stuff deck. It's going to have access to a lot of good removal and lots of solid creatures, and you know that'll be how you do well with this color pair most of the time. Now we finally get to green-white, which actually has a Signpost Uncommon, despite not being a normal gold card like the others we saw. It's an Aftermath card. It actually has a Signpost Uncommon that synergizes well with what green-white was in Triple Amonkhet. And in Triple Amonkhet, Exert was sort of what green-white wanted to do. It was basically an aggro deck. On-Crop Champion lets you untap all your creatures when it exerts itself. So if you have other creatures with Exert, they can exert again next turn. Appeal to Authority is also good with creatures with Exert. Appeal, you can pump your creature a lot and give it trample. And then if you also cast Authority, you get to tap 2 creatures and give your whole team Vigilance. So your creatures with Exert will be untapped and able to exert themselves again next turn. So this color pair actually has a synergistic Signpost Uncommon. But as we saw, the creatures with Exert in this set aren't nearly as aggressive as they were in Amonkhet. There are a few who are aggressive, though, like our friend Oketra's Avenger, who we saw earlier. Steward of Solidarity, though, you know, it's a decent 2-mana 2/2, but in the late game it stops attacking because it doesn't exert itself and get bigger. It just makes you creature tokens, which works well when you're going wide. Vizier of the True is a nice exert payoff. Ronus' Stalwart is another aggressive exert creature, one of the few in the set, and it's at least a common, so getting multiple copies is possible. Oasis Ritualist, not an aggressive exert creature, but it does help you fix and ramp. Hope Tender, basically the same thing. So again, not a lot of exert in this color pair either, but it's there. It's just not quite as aggressive as it used to be, whereas in Amonkhet we have amazing exert creatures like Bitterblade Warrior, Hooded Brawler, which was amazing, Watchful Naga, not so amazing, Devoted Cropmate, Gust Walker, which ended up being amazing, Ret Crop Spearmaster, Top Crop Elite. Those are all very good cards with Exert. They're all playable, Watchful Naga being the worst among them. So again, it feels just sort of like the power level, at least of aggressive creatures, is just much higher in Amonkhet. There are some Exert synergies around in Our Devastation. You've got Act of Heroism, which is a nice trick for an aggro deck anyway. It untaps your creatures so you can exert it again. Dauntless Haven can untap creatures when it attacks, meaning you can exert them again. Jeru's Resolve is from our Amonkhet, and I don't love it. I don't like it nearly as much as Act of Heroism, but it untaps your creature. So does Sparring Mummy, so exerting multiple times. We have a friend Trial of Solidarity, which was insane. Still going to be good, but I don't think the deck is going to be quite as aggressive. Initiate's Companion could untap your creatures, so could Spidery Grasp, and so could Synchronized Strike. Let's look at some of the rares. Well, Angel of Condemnation has Exert, and it's just an amazing card anyway. It's maybe the best card in the set, period, full stop. It is just an amazing card in general, but it does exert itself, so if you have some exert synergy, there you go. Glorybound Initiate is an amazing exerter. It's very difficult to deal with, and it makes it very difficult for them to race you. Prepare to Fight is in this color pair specifically. It has a trick that makes a creature untap, gives it lifelink, and it also has a removal spell attached to it with Aftermath. And Champion of Ronus also has Exert and lets you cheat things into play. Pride Sovereign is here, and it has Exert, but it's sort of, if you can manage to get some rares, including Regal Caracol and Amonkhet, you could build a cat deck in this color pair. This is the only color pair where you can really do that, and that would be pretty fun to do, but it also exerts itself. It's basically a gold card. You have to be playing it in green-white for it to be at its best anyway. So let's move from there to red-green. This color pair is mostly an aggro deck. You have Kenmare Charioteer, which, you know, sort of pushes you towards playing a little bit larger of creatures because you don't want to give trample to your 2/2s and 3/3s. Struggle to Survive is a signpost uncommon in Hour of Devastation, and it's not really a signpost, actually. Just a very good removal spell on the struggle half, and Survive is sort of a utility thing out of your graveyard late. But this color pair, to me, also seems the most interested in deserts, and I'll get to explaining why it is I think that. First, let's look at just the sheer number of aggressive creatures this color pair has at the low curve spots, especially 1 and 2 drops. So these are cards like Burning Fist Minotaur, one of the best 2-drops in the set. 2 mana, 2/1 first strikes off an R, but it can even pump itself. Defiant Kenra, a vanilla 2-drop, but if you want 2-drops, you'll be playing it. Firebrand Archer, similarly. Kenra Scrapper is one of the few aggressive Exert creatures, and it's nice. It's difficult to block, and it can get quite large. Fervent Paincaster is a nice creature. You can attack with it hard if you want to, if your opponent's board is empty, but you can also just start pinging your opponent to death. Frilled Sandwalla is nice because it's a 1/1, but it can be a 3/3 when it needs to be. Harrier Naga is just a 3 mana 3/3, but a perfectly fine card in an aggro deck. Hope Tender is nice because it can ramp you a little bit, and it's just a 2 mana 2/2. Ronus' Stalwart is a very, very good creature with Exert. Probably the best common or uncommon creature with Exert in Hour of Devastation. So you have that going for you. The thing this color pair has that red-white doesn't have quite as well is it also has monsters. It has mid-range creatures, you know, 5/6 drops that it can play that can make it so this deck can win in the late game too, in addition to having a quick start. It's not going to have quite as quick of a start as red-white. You know, things have to be balanced. It couldn't have an equally good start and also have better mid-range creatures. Instead, it has a somewhat slower of a start and has better mid-range creatures. So some of the monsters we're talking about are Granitic Titan, which is just a big creature with menace you can cycle early. Manticore Eternal, a great aggressive creature who has to attack every turn, so you know it's aggressive. And it has a Flick 3, so it gets around one of the major downsides of most creatures who have to attack every turn because no matter what, your opponent's taking damage. Bitter Bow Sharpshooters we've seen before. It's not the most exciting, but it is a large creature you can play in the middle part of the game. Quarry Beetle, same thing. Rampaging Hippo, like Granitic Titan, can be cycled away early and then be a big trampler in the late game. Sifter Worm we have here again. It's going to go well in this particular deck because you do have access to green's ramping, and you also have access to a quicker early start with red cards, and topping your curve out with Sifter Worm isn't a bad thing to do. So now let's get to talking about the whole desert thing that I mentioned. So the reason I think deserts will be at their best in this deck, and keep in mind every deck, every color has cards that care about deserts. I'm not saying this one is the only one, but this red is the color that definitely cares the most about them. Why? Because it's 2 cards that care about them. Sand Strangler and Gilded Cerodon are incredible. Maybe incredible is an exaggeration for the Cerodon, but the Strangler is incredible. The Cerodon becomes good if you have deserts somewhere. So if you have a few deserts in your deck, those 2 cards become very good. Sand Strangler is almost Flame Tongue Kavu, and Gilded Cerodon is a large Goblin Heel Cutter. Those are both things I'm interested in playing. The other thing is that the other red decks in the format aren't as interested in playing these guys. Red-White's too fast. Blue-Red probably doesn't want to waste time on deserts nearly as much. It doesn't have as many payoffs for them, although it does have these 2 cards, but the blue part isn't so good. And then there's also Sidewinder Naga, which has a decent desert payoff, and Dune Diviner is okay. You know, I think this color pair in general, with its combined needs for deserts, is the one that cares the most about them. And it also is the color pair that will most frequently want to be casting a card like Gilded Cerodon anyway. So I think you want deserts the most in this particular deck. But again, every color has cards that care about deserts, but red definitely has the 2 who are the most dependent on them, because other colors have cards that are good without deserts, but red has Sand Strangler and Gilded Cerodon, who without deserts just aren't good. So that does it for this whole limited review. I think in general this format will slow down, be less synergistic than the last format, and be a format where control decks can actually do something, because the Exert creatures have been dialed way back and we only have one pack of Amonkhet. So I'm looking forward to playing the format. I'll be doing draft videos of it as soon as I can, as soon as it goes up on Magic Online, and I'm excited to do it. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. If you have any comments about this video, you think I got something wrong, you think maybe this format will be faster or something, let me know in the comments below. Discussing these things helps us all out. And if you want to make sure you catch all of my future videos, including the draft videos I mentioned, future limited review videos, don't forget to subscribe. Also, starting with Hour of Devastation, I've teamed up with 5colorcombo.com to improve drafting on their app. My card ratings are now used to help determine when the AI should select the cards, so the app has become much more realistic in terms of draft. So it is a great way to prepare for the format. Go check it out at 5colorcombo.com. You can find a link in the description below.